Of the millions of people who have filed through human history, none are held in such awe, nor remembered so well as the prophets. Compared to them, even the greatest artists, thinkers, and achievers seem like minor players. For nothing seems to capture the imagination or aspirations of humanity so much as the idea of a person who possesses higher knowing and can guide and enlighten others. The tradition of the prophets began in the West with a man named Moses, a biblical figure who is one of our earliest examples and enduring models of what a prophet is and how he works. Although there are some who think Moses wasn't an actual person or that he was a composite of many people, scholars generally believe that he was real and that his story, although mingled with legend over time, is authentic in its outline. That story may be taken literally or symbolically, but either way, it offers examples of the meaning of faith, courage, and obedience to divine will. Moses has traditionally been considered the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis, which is why these works are called the Book of Moses. They make up the Torah, the sacred text of Judaism. Of these 5, the last 4 tell of Moses' life: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In addition, the biblical accounts of his life seem to come from varied sources of different time periods, the earliest being written at least 200 years after he lived. They were passed orally from generation to generation until someone wrote them down between 1000 and 400 BC. The story of Moses is both spiritual and earthy, filled with the struggle and drama of human life and the glory of divine miracles. Moses himself is a complex person of many roles and skills. Besides being a prophet and founder of the community of Israel, he was a political organizer, a military commander, a diplomat, a lawmaker, and a judge. He kept the Israelite nation united during its long years of wandering the desert between Egypt and Canaan, later called Palestine. It was not an easy task. His followers often complained and rebelled, and though Moses was mostly understanding, even he lost his temper now and then. Yet he had so much compassion for his people that he repeatedly intervened on their behalf when God threatened to punish or destroy them. Much of his work was as a mediator, a go-between who carried God's word to the people, interpreted it for them, and went back to God to defend them when they violated his word. It was a difficult position that required enormous energy, commitment, and patience. He can be viewed as a hero on any level, religious or historical. The life of Moses was dramatic from the beginning. Most people know the story of how he was placed in a basket and abandoned in a river by a mother who hoped to save his life. He was a Hebrew, born in Egypt, probably in the late 14th century BC, 200 to 500 years after Abraham. At the time, the pharaoh had become disturbed by the growing number of Hebrews in his land, which he saw as a threat to his power. The Hebrews had migrated to Egypt hundreds of years earlier from Canaan, which later became Palestine. The Egyptians had enslaved them and forced them to build large cities and palaces. What they were really building, however, was the ego of the pharaoh, who was trying to make up for a humiliating military defeat by constructing monuments to his glory. Over the years, the Hebrew population in Egypt had grown steadily, so that about the time of Moses' birth, Pharaoh had ordered the death of all newborn Hebrew males. This plan had been only partially successful, because the Hebrew midwives, who were instructed to kill newborn boys, didn't have the heart to do so. When Pharaoh sent for them and asked why they weren't following his orders, they told him the Hebrew women were not like Egyptian women. They're so strong and lively that they give birth before the midwives can even get there. In exasperation, Pharaoh then issued a proclamation that every newborn boy was to be thrown into the Nile. According to tradition, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months and then set him afloat on the Nile in a reed basket sealed with pitch. The baby's sister, Miriam, hid on the shore and waited to see what would happen. Then, who should come down to bathe in the river but the daughter of the Pharaoh himself, who discovered the baby, knew it must be a child of the Hebrews, and took pity on it. She decided to raise the child herself at the royal palace. The sister came forth at this point and offered to find a Hebrew woman who would nurse the baby, a plan that appealed to Pharaoh's daughter. Off went the girl to find the baby's true mother, who nursed and cared for her son until he was old enough to be turned over to the daughter of Pharaoh. That is how Moses, the child of Hebrews, came to be raised in the court of Pharaoh. The name of the Pharaoh at this time is never given in the Bible, but if the details of the story are accurate, scholars believe it would have been Seti I. The Bible is silent about the years Moses passed at court, but from his knowledge later, it can be assumed he received the usual training in religious, civil, and military subjects. Since Egypt controlled a large area, including Canaan, or Palestine, and Syria, Moses probably also had a broad knowledge of the Near East. Somewhere along the way, Moses made the discovery that he was really a Hebrew and felt compelled to visit his true people. It was a visit that would change the course of his life. While he walked among the Hebrews, Moses saw the oppressive and brutal conditions under which they labored. When he witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beat one of the slaves, probably to death, he could no longer contain his outrage. After checking to make sure no one was in sight, he killed the Egyptian and hid his body. Moses was probably trained in combat and was in excellent physical condition. The next day Moses returned to his people, determined to see if he could help them further. This time the trouble was among the Hebrews themselves. He found 2 slaves fighting, separated them, and tried to mediate the dispute. The 2 questions they posed to him shocked him. The first was, "Who made you the prince and judge over us?" And the second was, "Do you intend to kill us as you killed the Egyptian?" Somehow his crime had been discovered. Realizing that Pharaoh would soon hear of the secret too, Moses fled to Midian, an area of northwest Arabia. The Bible doesn't describe Moses' journey to Midian, but it had to be a very arduous one. He would have had to cross the Wall of the Ruler, a series of forts on the eastern border where the Suez Canal is now located, and he would have then had to make his way across a long stretch of desolate and arid country. While Moses was resting at a well, 7 daughters of a priest named Jethro came to water their father's flock. Other shepherds then arrived and drove the girls away so they could water their own flocks. Moses came to the rescue and once again showed his courage and skill as a warrior. He fought off the shepherds, and as a reward, the priest Jethro invited him to stay on. Moses accepted and eventually married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. They had 2 sons named Gershom and Eliezer. Jethro had given Moses responsibility for his flocks, a position that required him to roam the wilderness looking for suitable pastures. A long time passed, and Pharaoh died, and a new one took the throne of Egypt. Still, the Hebrews were in bondage, and so loud were their cries, says the Bible, that God heard them and remembered his covenant with Abraham, that he would protect his people. One day, at the base of a mountain, Moses came across a most extraordinary sight. There a bush seemed to be aflame, yet in spite of the fire, the bush itself was neither burned nor consumed. He had seen bushes before that seemed to be aflame with brilliant red blossoms, but this looked entirely different. As he drew closer to investigate, suddenly a voice warned him to come no nearer. Then he was ordered to remove his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. The burning bush in this biblical story may or may not be a symbol. The important point is that Moses had an experience that made him conscious of the presence of God. This God told him he was the same God of Abraham's son Isaac, and of Isaac's son Jacob, or Israel. His name, he told Moses, was Yahweh, and he was to be called that forevermore. Yahweh is a form of the verb to be, and means he who creates or brings into being. God also told Moses that in the future he and all Hebrews would worship at this mountain. But the words that astounded Moses the most were when God called on him to deliver and free the Hebrews in Egypt and lead them to the land that had been promised to Abraham. Immediately Moses tried to find some way to escape this responsibility. He had already fled Seti I and didn't welcome the idea of returning to the new Pharaoh, who historians believe was Ramses II. And the idea of one man single-handedly rescuing thousands of Hebrew slaves from a powerful and vindictive ruler seemed somewhat overwhelming. According to the Bible, Moses begged to be released from the charge on the grounds that he was a stammerer and therefore could hardly be an able leader. God said only that he'd help Moses improve. Finally, Moses pleaded, "O my Lord, send, I pray, some other person." God was beginning to grow angry at this point, but he agreed that Moses could take along his eloquent brother Aaron, who could serve as spokesman. He also took the staff Moses was holding and showed him how he could use it to perform miracles. After his experience before the burning bush, Moses returned to Jethro and asked permission to return to Egypt to visit his people, concealing the higher purpose behind his journey. Permission granted, he took his wife and sons and set out on his mission to liberate the Hebrews. Ramses II had become pharaoh when he was still a teenager, and like all pharaohs, he claimed to be divine. Therefore he was somewhat taken aback when Moses approached him at the palace and said, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go. They are to journey into the wilderness and have a festival in my name." As a god in human form, Ramses was not used to taking orders from other gods, particularly an unknown like this God Yahweh of the Hebrews. "Who is this Lord?" he asked. "Why should I listen to him? I don't know him, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Then Moses told him that they should make a 3-day journey into the wilderness to make sacrifices to this god, or else he might send down a plague upon them. Pharaoh sneered at this suggestion, for it was clear to him that all Hebrews were lazy and that Moses simply wanted to take the people away from their duties. No, he would not release the Hebrews into the wilderness. No, he would not permit sacrifices or festivals to this god, and with that, he sent Moses away. Each had made his position clear. Now, the battle began. On one side was the arrogant Pharaoh with much worldly power, who held himself to be a god. On the other hand was the brave Hebrew with no worldly power, who held himself to be a servant of God. The first play was made by Ramses. He responded to Moses' command by increasing the work and oppression of the Hebrews, requiring them now to gather their own straw for the bricks they made, and yet demanding they produce just as many. The Hebrews scattered throughout the land, desperately trying to find straw, and when they failed to produce as many bricks as before, they were beaten by their taskmasters. Under the weight of this impossible burden, many of the Hebrews blamed and rebuffed Moses, who turned to God in frustration. "Why did you send me?" he pleaded. God replied that Moses should return to Pharaoh and perform one of the miracles. Moses, with Aaron at his side, returned to the palace and asked the Pharaoh once more to release his people. When the Pharaoh refused, Aaron cast before the throne the staff Moses had been given by God. Instantly it turned into a slithering serpent. Still, Pharaoh did not listen. Once again, Moses pleaded to God for help. Yahweh told him not to worry. He himself would take action against Pharaoh, and so began the 10 great plagues on Egypt. First, the rivers of the Nile ran red blood. This plague, like many of the others, has an historical background. At the time Moses was bargaining with Ramses, excessively heavy rains had poured down in Ethiopia, at the source of the Blue Nile. They had washed powdery, deep red soil from the slopes of the hills, which had then picked up bright red algae in the lake at the base of the hill. Since there were no dams at the time, the blood-red waters of the Nile had flowed all the way to the Mediterranean and past the door of Pharaoh. The carmine-red rivers failed to convince Pharaoh to release the Hebrews. In his mind, it was a freakish event of nature, nothing to prove the might of the God of whom Moses spoke. But in the following months, more plagues followed. Frogs came up out of the waters and covered the land. Pharaoh called upon Moses and Aaron to beseech their God to destroy the frogs, promising he would then let the children of Israel go. Almost immediately, the frogs disappeared from the streets, houses, villages, and farms, but Pharaoh failed to keep his promise. Next, the very dust of the land turned into lice, and swarms of flies covered the ground and filled the houses of the Egyptians. Still, Pharaoh didn't listen. All the cattle of the Egyptians were sickened and died, but none of the cattle of the Hebrews was affected. And still the king did not waver. Then the men and animals of Egypt broke out in ugly, painful boils. Hail fell, locusts descended, and the sky became thick and dark, but only over the Egyptians. Even then, Pharaoh refused to release the Hebrews. If he did, he said, then other groups would demand the same privilege. His entire building program would be at risk. As the plagues increased, Pharaoh made an offer of compromise. He would allow the Hebrews to hold their ritual sacrifices in an area closer by. Moses refused the offer. He insisted the Hebrews be allowed to join him on a 3-day journey into the wilderness. Pharaoh came back with a counteroffer. The Hebrew men could make the journey, but not the women. Moses rejected this, too. The final offer from Pharaoh was this: the people could go on the journey, but they must leave behind their cattle as proof they would return. Again, Moses stood firm, and this time the Pharaoh drove him out. Moses and Pharaoh had gone 9 rounds, and still it seemed as if the freedom of the Hebrews was no closer than it had been before. But Moses had grown confident in his God by now and didn't despair. He'd been assured that Pharaoh would not have the last word. It was then that the last word of God, and most destructive plague of all, descended on Egypt. The firstborn in every Egyptian family was struck dead at midnight, including the Pharaoh's son and heir to the throne. From the nobles in their houses, to the captives in the dungeon, to even the cattle, every firstborn died. Pharaoh's murder of the firstborn of the Hebrews had returned to become his own grief. Pharaoh rose in the middle of the night, as did all his servants and all the Egyptians, to wail over their dead. There was not a house that had not lost someone, except the houses in which the Hebrews dwelled. Pharaoh ordered the Hebrews to leave, and later regretted his decision. This was the beginning of the great flight from Egypt, known as the Exodus. The Hebrews had barely departed, however, when Pharaoh sent out his army to pursue them and return them to Egypt. They were cornered at the Sea of Reeds, which barred their exit to the east. The early understanding that this was the Red Sea is incorrect. In reality, it was a sea of papyrus, which grows in fresh water, and its exact location is a marshy lake in the far northeastern corner of Egypt. Whether a Red Sea or a Sea of Reeds makes little difference. The fame of this moment in history rests on what happened, not where. And what happened is one of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible. Trapped at the sea, with the Egyptians close on their heels, the Hebrews turned on Moses in fear and anger. Moses called on God to help, then advised his people to remain calm and watch for deliverance. All that night a strong wind blew from the east, and when the Hebrews looked at the sea, they saw the wind had swept the waters aside, creating a corridor through which they could pass. Moses heard a command from God to lift his staff and stretch his hand over the sea. As he did, the final waters parted, revealing an avenue to safety. Moses led his people through the corridor, a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. And once they reached the other side, he and his sister Miriam led them in a song of rejoicing. The Egyptians followed on horseback and in chariots, but as they entered the corridor, Moses knew he should spread his hands once again. When he did, the waters of the sea returned, and all the army was drowned to the last man. Pharaoh's question, "Who is this God, and why should I listen to him?" had been answered once and for all. Once across the sea and free of Egypt, Moses led his people towards Mount Sinai at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. It was a long journey across the desert, and his people often complained about the lack of food and water. When they did find water, it was too bitter to drink, so Moses appealed to Yahweh, and he sweetened it. He also filled the ground each morning with small round delicacies that tasted of honey, which the people ate and called manna. When they came to places where there was no water, the people complained again. "Why," they asked Moses, "have you brought us out of Egypt just to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" He was instructed to tap the rock with his rod, and when he did, water flowed freely. So here they decided to make their camp. While camping at this rock, the Hebrews were attacked by a tribe named Amalek that lived in the wilderness. Moses chose his most able men and sent them out to fight. During the battle, he went to the top of a hill to observe, and from there he found that if he raised his staff with one hand, the Hebrews won. but whenever he let down his hand, the Hebrews lost. By now Moses was very old and very tired. It was difficult to hold one arm up continuously. So he sat himself on a stone, and Aaron and another man held his arm up for him. Moses remained like this all day until at sunset his people had defeated the Amalekites. 3 months after leaving Egypt, Moses brought the Hebrews to Mount Sinai, where God had spoken to him in the form of a burning bush. Now Yahweh would speak to him again. This time God appeared in a terrific thunder and lightning storm at Mount Sinai. Moses went up into the mountain and remained there 40 days and nights. During that time, God described the agreement that now existed between him and the Hebrews, whom he'd saved. From now on, he said, the Hebrews would be known as the nation of Israel. Because of the love and care he had shown them, Yahweh now commanded a pledge of their obedience to his will. These instructions he gave to Moses in the form of the 10 Commandments, which were inscribed on 2 stone tablets. The covenant provided that all Israelites would live under God's eternal love and protection, and in exchange they would follow his laws. The laws defined the Israelis' relationship with God and with one another. Because Yahweh was the only true God, one of the first 10 Commandments was a ban against all other gods. There was also a ban against making images of God. Moses came down from the mountain with an understanding that if the Hebrews were to have a just and stable society, they would have to emulate their God. Murder, adultery, theft, lying, and covetousness would destroy the community and its special link with the divine. While Moses had been on the mountain in communion with God, his people had grown impatient and began to suspect something had happened to him. They asked Aaron to make new gods for them to worship, and brought him their gold jewelry to be melted and made into an idol. When Moses returned, he found them worshiping and dancing before a golden calf idol set up by his own brother. So angry was he that he smashed the stone tablets on which the commandments had been inscribed. Then he took the calf they had made and burned it in a fire. When that was done, he ground it into powder, threw it in the water, and made his people drink it. Moses then took a place at the entrance of the camp and called out that everyone on God's side join him. Many of those who refused to come were slain. When the crisis had passed, Moses cut 2 more tablets out of stone, like the first ones, and carried them back up the mountain. He found Yahweh angry too, and prepared to disown the Israelites, saying he would begin anew with the descendants of Moses. It was Moses who interceded on their behalf, even asking to have his own name blotted from God's book, if God could not forgive them. Yahweh did not destroy the Israelites, but soon afterwards many of them died, convincing the others they were being punished for their sin and leading them to accept the covenant. God carved a new copy of the 10 Commandments into the stone tablets Moses had brought, and sent him back down the mountain. When he reached the camp, his face shone with such a bright light that his followers were afraid to even approach him. For the next days he taught them the laws and commandments that God had given him, and told them of their covenant. Once they'd accepted and confirmed the covenant, the real challenge began. For the people were not just to know the covenant, but to live by it. This meant that Moses would have to interpret the commands and issue ordinances and guidelines for specific situations. No longer was he only Moses, their leader. Now he was Moses, the lawgiver. The laws Moses created came from private moments in his tent when he communed with God, as the Bible says, face to face, as a man speaks to a friend. Any violation of the covenant would mean the person would have to atone, and that in turn meant there would have to be a priesthood to direct the atonements and officiate at sacrifices and in worship. He designed a movable structure for religious services called a tabernacle, which served as the official meeting place for God and the people. There would also have to be a system of judges and hearings to regulate civil matters. Here at Sinai, the entire structure of the Hebrew community was formed. Israel remained in the desert under Moses' leadership for many years, camping at oases. As the Hebrews left Sinai and began their journey to Canaan, Moses had to confront more and more problems as a leader. The people became increasingly frustrated with the difficulties of their travels. and more resistant to his orders. They challenged his authority and questioned their faith in a God they could not see. Even when they at last arrived at the promised land, they refused to enter. Their spies had reported that although the land was rich and fertile, the inhabitants were strong and had many walled cities. In their fear, they couldn't accept that God was still with them and would protect them. When Moses urged them to continue and conquer the land of Canaan, his people almost stoned him rather than obey. Again, he had to intercede with Yahweh, who once more threatened to destroy them and raise up an even greater nation. Instead, he turned them back to the desert to continue their dreary wandering. Moses kept his patience. Over and over, he reminded his people of what God had already done for them, encouraged them to have faith, and did his best to meet their needs and calm their fears. He lost his patience only once. This occurred when the people complained about the lack of water again. God had told Moses to use his staff and speak to a rock as he had done before, and that water would flow freely. But exasperated by the constant defiance of his people, Moses instead took a stone and struck the rock twice in anger, calling his people rebels. When he did so, water flowed forth, but so did God's anger. According to tradition, it was because of this lapse in self-control and faith that God would not allow Moses to enter the promised land of Canaan. The Hebrews continued, sometimes circling unfriendly territories, sometimes led by Moses to conquer them, in what they saw as holy wars. Often they were attacked by hostile tribes, but always Moses led them to victory. He led one of these successful military campaigns shortly before his death, when, according to the Bible, he was far beyond the age of 100. When they survived the years of wanderings, years that probably totaled about 40, they finally arrived again at the border of the Promised Land. Moses renewed the covenant made at Sinai as his last official act. He called together the leaders of the 12 tribes and blessed them. He laid his hand over Joshua and gave his leadership over to him. Then, at an age said to be 120, he left his camp in the Jordan Valley and climbed to the top of a mountain from which he could view the land of promise that spread out before him. He saw all the land of Canaan as far as it stretched to the sea. He saw the plain of the valley of Jericho and the city of palm trees. As he looked, he heard God say, "This is the land which I promised. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over into it." Moses had led his people there as commanded, but he himself could not enter. After Moses climbed the mountain, the Israelis never saw him again. What happened on the mountain and his death and burial remain a mystery. According to tradition, Yahweh buried Moses himself. After the death of Moses, Joshua led the nation of Israel into the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. Without Moses, there would be no Israel. It was he who led the Hebrews from Egypt, guided them through many hardships to a new land, and founded their community. As the vehicle and interpreter of the Ten Commandments, he left a lasting influence on the religious life, morals, and social ethics of Western civilization. Even if Moses is viewed as an ordinary man, his greatness is exceptional. He was gifted with many talents and strengths, met almost impossible challenges, withstood severe pressures, and through it all maintained his understanding and compassion. He served his people as leader, organizer, legislator, and in his intercessions with Yahweh as priest. But his true greatness is in his personal experience of Yahweh. In effect, he became God's spokesman. He lived in constant communication with him, never leaving his presence for a moment, never acting on his own will, which, in fact, ceased to exist. Every thought and deed was merged with the will of God. The Bible pays as great a tribute to Moses as anyone can when it says, "And there arose not a prophet in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Few men or women have ever known God so intimately, nor served him so well, as did the prophet Moses.